This is the download from Sounds Profitable, the most important news from this week and why it matters to people in the business of podcasting. I'm Manuela Correa.
And I'm Shreya Sharma.
The download is brought to you by Podscribe. Find out more at podscribe.com.
This week, our recap of advertising news leading up to and during the Super Bowl, most publishers grew their branded content offerings last year, and the subtle key to podcasting's persuasiveness. Let's get started.
This past Sunday, the biggest game in American football happened, an advertising highlight of the year. For our first story of the day, we're collecting all the news highlights surrounding the Super Bowl. Let's get started. First up, the power of build-up. According to Edison Research Q4 podcast metrics, New Heights with Jason and Travis Kelce is the podcast Cinderella story of late last year. The podcast, hosted by two brothers playing for different teams, as they discuss life in the NFL, rocketed from 67th place on Edison's rankings in Q3 to 6th place in Q4. What changed in that time? Well, Travis Kelce began publicly dating pop idol Taylor Swift, causing a flood of infamously passionate Swifties to become dedicated listeners of New Heights. A new injection of listeners so powerful, the audience makeup of the comedic football chat show is now 50% female. Last Friday, Alyssa Boyle of Ad Exchanger wrote on how this year's game would be all about reaching Gen Z. The classic Super Bowl demographic of people only watching for the ads might be hitting a generational divide. A report from Ad Taxi found a higher percentage of respondents were anticipating watching the actual game, with ad-interested respondents only making up 25%, in contrast to 24% last year. That said, it is worth noting that similar to New Heights, the shadow of Taylor Swift loomed over the game as Swifties had the dramatic appeal of Travis Kelce's team playing. In addition to pop star fandom, younger viewers had a new take on football as Paramount Plus streamed a Nickelodeon-themed simulcast hosted by live animated SpongeBob SquarePants characters. The biggest uphill battle for Super Bowl ads, however, is Gen Z's lack of interest in traditional advertising. For a podcast perspective, we went to Gen Z Media's CEO and co-founder Ben Strauss, who had this to say. What we've seen is that Gen Zers respond to advertising that in some fashion speaks to them directly. Strauss says podcast advertising is especially effective with Gen Z due to the medium's emphasis on intimacy and authenticity, qualities Gen Z actively seeks. Which leads us to our final segment of our Super Bowl roundup, Pepsi's involvement, or lack thereof, in the game itself. According to Marketing Brew's Alyssa Myers, Pepsi has taken a step back over the last 2 years, no longer sponsoring the halftime show and this year electing not to run an ad during coveted Super Bowl commercial breaks. Instead, Pepsi focused on running its Get Wild campaign for cherry-flavored Pepsi everywhere it could in relevant locations around the Super Bowl. For a podcasting perspective, we asked Cameron Hendricks of Magellan AI what Pepsi has been up to in podcasting recently. Here's what he had to say. Pepsi's Get Wild campaign also launched on podcasts in the week leading up to the Super Bowl. Magellan AI detected pre- and mid-roll spots on more than 100 podcasts during the week of January 29th. End quote. While the Super Bowl itself is a prestigious moment in advertising, podcasts are in the ears of diehard fans, and as the medium moves the message found last year, those audiences have a tendency to support brands that sponsor their favorite podcasts. Brands like Pepsi take full advantage of the perfect storm of sports fandom and podcasting's advertising powers by increasing spend in the run-up to major events like the Super Bowl.
This Tuesday from Juliet Tabiz. A new Digiday survey studies the responses of over 300 publishing professionals in Q4 of last year. Of those surveyed, 56% grew their ad products last year, with a good portion of that growth being attributed to branded content. 58% of respondents said their companies added branded content this year, making it the top category of new ad product added last year for respondents. For a podcast perspective, we reached out to Shannon Martin, podcast strategist at Lower Street, for comment. Quote, "We continue to see growth both in use of branded content and in greater sophistication in how it's being deployed. That trend appears set to continue as evidenced by the overwhelming response to our recent Brand Podcast Summit, both in terms of attendance and engagement. 37% of attendees were directors or higher-level managers, and 21% were company founders. 65% had existing branded podcasts they were adding to or growing, and the rest intended to launch a brand podcast this year. End quote. Branded content is no new addition to podcasting, but in recent months, the industry has become more vocal about its capabilities. And on the subject of the Brand Podcast Summit, Lower Street will be hosting the next iteration on April 24th of this year.
This Wednesday from Tom Webster on Sounds Profitable. The power of a podcast host's ability to connect with audiences is often talked about as one of podcasting's strengths, but rarely is it broken down into the components that make up the whole. A podcast host can be charismatic, knowledgeable, or entertaining, but those qualities aren't unique to the industry. Any given favorite YouTuber or linear TV host can easily have those features. Webster proposes one key factor podcasting particularly engages with is one of empathy. A particularly strong case of this is the recent success of Body Electric, a short podcast series produced by NPR and hosted by Manoush Zomorodi. The core premise itself is an experiment. Can a podcast get people to physically move more? Podcasts can sell mattresses, websites, and meal kits. But can it combat sedentary lifestyles that have become far more prevalent since COVID lockdowns? For that experiment, Body Electric partnered with Columbia University Medical Center to run a study with volunteers in the audience. Over 20,000 respondents registered for the study, logging the amount of walk breaks they took daily and reporting both fatigue and emotional states throughout the experiment. Fatigue reduced 25%, and the data showed the more respondents moved, the better they felt. Manoush described the community that formed around the podcast and study as a feedback loop between the show and its listeners. Here's a quote from Manoush. I think it does come back to talking to people about problems they've sensed they had, but couldn't put words to. When you are able to explain to someone through a story or reporting or just talking in conversation, if you're making the listener think like, oh my God, that's exactly how I feel. Thank you, yes, that's it. This sort of moment of feeling seen, ironically, by a podcaster. That's a connection that they will be very loyal to if they feel understood by you. End quote. Empathy is a powerful tool. If the audience believes the host is on the same journey as them, the audience is more likely to take that first step, whether a literal one in the case of Body Electric or something more. As Webster says in his conclusion, let's embrace this opportunity and make every word count, with a little empathy. Surely, that's not a bad thing.
Finally, it's time for our quick hits. These are articles that didn't quite make the cut for today's episode, but are still worth including in your weekend reading. This week, Acast expects short-term impact on listens from Apple update by Ella Sager. The Q4 financial report for Acast reflects a decrease in podcast downloads that the company attributes to the iOS 17 update back in September. That said, they believe the long-term change will be a net positive for the industry as the strength of the download metric is reinforced by said update. Slate reports best year by Max Danny. In the company's 27 years of business, Slate reports 2023 was their most profitable year, and the podcasts made up 50% of their ad revenue for the year. Authentic multicultural narratives create true diversity in audio advertising by Antonio Francisco Luis. To avoid falling into stereotypes or over-reliance on ethnolects, when targeting multicultural audiences, advertisers working in audio need to ensure creative directors with relevant backgrounds are involved on the project to give it authenticity. The Value of Measuring the Upper Funnel by Paul Rees-Mandel. Direct response marketers tend to jump past the first few levels of the marketing funnel, but it's important to remember lower-level marketing tactics work best when leveraging awareness built at the top of the funnel. The Creator Economy, Boom Not Bust, by Ross Adams. The Acast CEO discusses the growing creator economy and how marketers can properly take advantage of it.
And that was The Download, brought to you by Sounds Profitable. I know we went through today's stories fast, so be sure to check out the links to every article mentioned. right in your podcast listening app or on soundsprofitable.com/podcast. And thank you for sticking with us as we bring you the top stories you might have missed from the past week. I'm Manuela Correa.
And I'm Shreya Sharma. Our producers are Brian Barletta, Gavin Gaddis, and Tom Webster. Special thanks to Spreaker for hosting the download. And as always, thank you to you for joining us. Robot?
Download complete.